Hello, my name is Frank Uekoetter from the University of Birmingham, and this video is my contribution to the workshop on historical sources on environmental activism, where I'm, if I understand my task here correctly, supposed to say a few words about environmental activism in Germany and how you can follow it in the archives. The number of ways in which you can access environmental activism is there quite a range of files that you can use here. I will limit myself here to files on the history of the conflicts over nuclear power in Germany. That is a large enough topic and actually one of the defining conflicts of Germany after 1945. The German environmental movement, at least the West German environmental movement, grew to a very significant out of protests against nuclear power stations. So looking at that is really, you get a kind of a microcosm of what German environmentalism is, and you understand a very good deal about what environmental activism means by looking at those groups. That's a conflict that started in the 1970s, but that continued, well, in a way continues to our time. It lost a lot of its vigor when the German government, after the Fukushima nuclear incident, decided to phase out nuclear power in Germany. And at the moment, the last reactors in Germany are supposed to go off the grid by the end of this year. Now, activism is always challenging when you look at historical sources, because unlike government files, there is no way that these things naturally end up in an archive. They need to be collected. Somebody needs to take the extra effort to preserve those records. And I'm happy to report that there are two major archives in Germany that, if you are interested in nuclear conflicts, maybe you should visit. There is the New Social Movement Archive in Freiburg in the southwest of Germany, which has a lot of material on the landmark conflict on the Wiel nuclear power station, a proposed reactor in the southwest on the Rhine near the Kaiserstuhl. That was the first campaign against the nuclear reactor that really captured the imagination of the entire region. Those files have been preserved to a very significant extent in a special social movement archive. The second big archive is the archive of a citizen initiative in northern Germany. A nuclear repository was planned for a small town named Gorleben, and this plan, which was abandoned just very recently, triggered a 40-year campaign against a nuclear deposit in that part. This is the Wendland. This is a very rural region, used to be on the right on the border between the Federal Republic and the GDR. If you have a 40-year conflict, you have a lot of material. Unfortunately, there is an archive in the town of Lüchow that collects files on this conflict. Of course, you should also always look at these internal files against the backdrop of official records at the state and the federal level. They collected information on these groups. They were in contact with these groups on a regular basis, so you can learn a lot about them by looking at these files. There is the self-documentation. Watch for magazines and periodicals that give you an idea of how the movement took. There were several of that written by the activists without professional journalists, but these were magazines that had a circulation of, well, a few thousand, and were really important for communicating within the group, and they were also a reflection of what was going on inside the group. So you have a lot of paper that is going there. I would like to flag one source that has recently come more into view. That's the police files. Lots of these demonstrations were large. Some of these demonstrations turned violent. In fact, one of the reasons why you should look at the nuclear conflict is it was one of the conflicts that really defined the legitimate and the illegitimate rules for large demonstrations. How do you deal with violent activists? It was nuclear protests more than anything else that defined the limits of legitimate activism. And we can study that not just through the conversation within the groups, but also through government files. And the government was very eager to follow these groups, to monitor, see what they were doing. And these files are now becoming available if the protest is at least 30 years ago. And I was going through these archives, was surprised about the extent of material that is in there, and the clarity by which they provide. But you should be wary that some archives are more generous than others. And I'm specifically mentioning the Wackersdorf conflict in Bavaria here, where really it's very hard to get any government files on that project. And if you know that the conflict on Wackersdorf, this is the second half of the 1980s, a reprocessing plant that was hugely controversial, well, there is a very good chance that these files are not available because the government doesn't want you to see those files, because there are awkward things in there about tactics and the views of the police. We do not know, but while a lot of files are available, some files are still off limits, even though the 30 years have passed for this project. So government secrecy is still an issue, particularly for selected projects. What I would urge you to look at this in a diverse way to get an understanding of the different perspectives. It's rewarding to look at the minutes in combination with articles on protests, issues in the activist press, and it's rewarding to look against all that against the backdrop of the official, the large newspapers. There is extensive coverage from a very early moment on, so you can draw on that. And I think it's important to have this multitude of perspectives, because only then can you really assess what is important, what is the running discourse, and where are the conflicts. And that's maybe what I would like to close on here. There's a tendency when you talk about environmental activism to look at the glorious moments, the large demonstrations, the moments that changed something, the moments that had charisma. That's important. That's what carries this movement through many, many years. But there is also routine. There are conflicts. There are some bitter moments. Yes, there is violence. Democracy isn't always marvelous and grandiose. It's also something very boring, very slow-moving, not very exciting, and sometimes hard to bear, because the conflicts ran through these groups and these conflicts weren't always resolved. But I think when you talk about environmental activism, we talk about this in a society that, well, thinks more about democracy than it did 10 years ago. The challenge of right-wing populism is still out there. The doubts whether Western democracies get too lame, too indecisive, all these things are out there, and you shouldn't make a taboo here. I think what you see when you look at environmental activism history is that it is sometimes grandiose, sometimes marvelous, but often conflictual, very taxing for people. It costs a lot of nerve to go through these negotiations. It's, I think, time for a real world history of the nuclear conflict, maybe of environmentalism in general. Not to criticize these people, but to give an idea about what life in a democracy really is, what it takes from people, what that it requires from people to be true democrats, but also because in the end you may be successful, because that is the charming thing about looking at files from the German nuclear history. In the end, you talk about a success story of democracy, in that the German activists achieved a phase out of nuclear power in Germany that would have looked different without their activism. And if you look at embattled democracy in our time, well, what better way to pay your tribute to democracy by writing an honest, multidimensional history of how this came about. Thanks for your attention.